Welcome to Going In Blind. I'm your host, Zach Tidwell, and my guest today is a Marine Corps infantry veteran and Silver Star recipient, former CIA paramilitary operations officer and author. Please welcome Adam Sikes. And to everyone at home, thank you for listening. Please take a second to help me grow the show so that I can keep delivering these conversations week after week for years to come. Subscribe, rate, and review the show in whatever podcasting app you're using right now, and check out the show notes to follow me on social media and YouTube as well. When you share your favorite episodes, tag me and use the hashtag GoingInBlind. You can also join my mailing list at zachtidwell.net. And if you know someone you think I should talk to, have them send me an email at contact.goinginblind@gmail.com. Adam, you have had one hell of a career, haven't you, man?
Yeah, well, no, thank you. Thank you for reaching out, and thank you for the opportunity to be here on your show, Zach. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, I think Jeff Circle connected us. I don't even remember how. I think it was just after I had him on the show. He was like, dude, I have someone else you need to talk to. And so, I mean, this has been a couple months coming now, and I typically book like 2 months out or so, but I think this one's been even longer. But I've been anxiously waiting and excited to pick your brain. I think,
Yeah,
obviously, go ahead.
well, I was gonna say, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Jeff was the one who connected us. Jeff's a good friend. He does great work. So I'm glad you had him on, and I'm glad to make the connection as one veteran to another.
Yeah, and that's, there's always that when I get a chance to talk to another veteran, there's like, okay, I know we're gonna hit it off. That's just that camaraderie that comes out. But another Marine, another devil dog to talk to. And then when I was reading and into the notes that you had sent me and saw that you were in 2-5, which was, people listening, was the sister battalion to my battalion, 3-5. So we have sweated in some of the same dirt out in the backyard behind San Mateo.
Oh, San Mateo.
Yeah. But I guess just to get into things here, because there is so much, I'm curious. I think people are always curious as to what draws someone to the Marine Corps, and then especially the infantry on top of that. And I know you'd mentioned that your grandparents were in that World War II era. Was there a World War II Marine in your family?
So there was not. Neither of my grandparents were in the Marines. I had an uncle who was a Marine in Vietnam, but I only met him once. And I met him after I'd already decided that I wanted to go in the Marine Corps. I grew up in the late 70s and 80s. I was that generation where, you left the house as soon as breakfast was over, and then you came back when they turned the streetlights on, kind of a thing. And
Latchkey kid.
yeah, I mean, we're just out, and I mean, we're around the neighborhood. I remember riding bikes miles and miles away from home, and just everything we were doing and getting into. And you might go inside if you were hungry and check in, but that was kind of how we grew up. And I was born in Northern California, but spent my elementary and junior high years outside Boston in this town called Burlington, Mass. I went back there a couple years ago. I'll tell that story later. But yeah, I mean, it was a kind of a working class area, maybe middle class, and it was a great place to grow up in. But I grew up in Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts, and my grandfather on my mother's side, George, who was a significant influence in my life, he was an Eagle Scout. My father was a scout, and growing up, hearing the stories about World War II and the Greatest Generation. So, one of my grandfathers served in the South Pacific. He ended up in Australia at one point convalescing, and that's where he met my grandmother, who was an Australian. And so, part of my family is Australian, still down there. She came over in 1947 on a troop ship after the war to marry my grandfather. My other grandfather, he was in Army Signals Intelligence, and he spent a lot of his time in the Northern California coast. But I grew up with these stories, going to the VFW, big barbecues and picnics, and around these these men and these women who really viewed this country in a very special and revered way. And that was, I think, really stitched into me as a young kid. And what I found myself getting more and more geared to do was then join the Marine Corps myself. I made that decision probably in elementary school, as maybe not the Marine Corps, but I knew I wanted to serve. And then over time, that desire refined itself to where nothing was going to stop me. I was going to join the Marine Corps. And I did,
Yeah.
1995.
Yeah, that's like funny. I was the same way where I knew my entire life I was going into the military, and then high school is when I decided the Marine Corps, and was like, if I'm going in the Marines, I'm going to be an infantryman.
Yeah.
I'm gonna do it right. Like I'm going to get the full experience here. And as a naive 16-year-old, when I first decided that, I was like, if you're going to serve your country, that's the only way to do it, which is so naive. But I, you said something about the way that your grandparents spoke about this country, and I'm curious because so I was born in 95. So I remember I was in kindergarten when 9/11 happened. Do you but I've heard people talking about, the patriotism that swept over the country in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. And obviously you weren't alive during the time that they were referencing, but the way that they spoke about it, do you feel like that was kind of rekindled post 9/11 in following the attacks, or was it still different?
I think there were similarities. Absolutely. I mean, if you look at our entry into World War II with the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, that galvanized the entire country that we needed to enter this global war that had already been going on for 2 years. For those who are listening who, like history or maybe are historians themselves, Nazi Germany had been gearing up for a war for a decade in Europe. And they're moving that direction, with everything that kicked off in 39 and then what they did with Poland and then going into France and everything else was going on. And by that point, we weren't in the war yet. Rommel was sweeping through North Africa and we were still on the sidelines. Same thing in the Pacific with Imperial Japan. They were moving across the Pacific and they were occupying and having that imperialist agenda. And then on December 7th, that's when we entered the war. And I would say that event, because TV was around back then. They had TV, they had footage, they had radio. World War I was a little bit different. They did have things like TV and footage and radio, but I think those images of the battleships sinking in Pearl Harbor and the smoke and everything that happened really, you know, brought this country to recognize we've got to join this and we are going to finish it through the end. And that's what they did, and I know my grandfather, the one that was in the Navy, he joined within a week or so. He joined the Navy within a week or so after Pearl Harbor. He's from Southern California. He grew up in San Bernardino, which is not too far where I'm at now. My other grandfather was in Northern California, and, he grew up in the Depression, and I've got pictures of him from the Depression with his family where it looks like something out of the Great Giraffe or Ken's Burn documentary, where there's an outhouse and there's barefoot and there's 10 kids, and it just looks like the Dust Bowl. I mean, they grew up in that era, and I know he joined the Army, within a couple weeks of, December 7th as well. And so when 9/11 happened, flash forward, what, 60 years or so, I had been in the Marine Corps by that point for already 6 years. I joined in '95, but I grew up under the what I'll call the shadow of the Cold War. I remember 1985 when Red Dawn comes out with Patrick Swayze, that's what it was. It was the Soviets, it was the Russians, and
Yes, the
that's what
big red scare.
exactly. And there's a lot of, legitimacy to that about how we were thinking during that period and the real threat of another global war that would involve nuclear weapons on a scale that would have destroyed this world over
Oh,
and
and
over
we're
again.
in that right now, which is
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
absurd. I mean, it is. Again, I wasn't around during that time, but this feels very reminiscent of that, right? Like it is there's another, it's just a constant string of proxy wars all over the world right now. And it feels like all it needs is a little air to be breathed into the coals here to spark a real fire.
Yeah, I would say, when the wall fell, when the Berlin Wall fell, there was this feeling that, this idea of great power politics was kind of going away. And I think great power politics are back now, without a doubt. But going back to your question about 9/11, yeah, on when 9/11 happened and when the recognition hit that it was an attack and it was a coordinated attack. I know many individuals that served in the military that joined within days of 9/11. I'd already been in for a while. I was overseas when the planes hit. Was actually considering getting out and going on to my next stage of my life and going to college. But when those planes hit, there was no way I was leaving. That's the whole reason I joined. Um,
Is that, and you were on MSG duty when that happened, right?
Yes, yeah, I'd spent a year in Moscow, so my first year on MSG duty was in Moscow, which was a very exciting time, and then during 9/11, I was at the embassy in Lisbon, Portugal, when that hit. I remember we were going through an audit of our MSG fund, when the planes hit, and one of the Marines we were in the dining room going through the books, and a Marine came over and said, "Hey, a plane just hit the World Trade Center." And we just all kind of looked around, and I remember thinking, "Oh, it must have been like a Cessna, a private plane or something like that." So we went over and looked, and no, it was an airliner. I said, "Wow." And then we went back to work, and then the second plane hit, and then the plane hit the Pentagon. And at that point, we knew that this was no accident.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to deny after three. That's right. And gosh, man, and for people at home, MSG is Marine Security Guard. So at every American embassy around the world, there are Marines stationed there, and they are the armed forces guarding the embassy. So you got to do that which it sounds like you got to float around to some sweet spots when you were doing that too, which is so cool.
It was
But
neat. It was a very good time.
I'm gonna get very. I almost didn't say anything about this, but because this is so far, just I'm not qualified to speak about this, but I want to ask you about it just because I know you're a history buff and you have a degree, and it sounds like you've done a lot more. You have a lot better awareness of all this than I do. You mentioned with the great power politics. Like the first thing that came to my mind with that is like, okay, that checks out with Russia, that checks out with Iran, that checks out with China, kind of checks out here, but like in my mind, that's almost born. I mean, outside of a dictatorship, I would think that's born out of nationalism, which seems like we don't really have here right now. Would you, I guess, in that context, but like in following that train of thought, I mean, that is, you do have the dictatorship in China, you have the dictatorship in Russia, and then essentially, the Islamic State running Iran. Do you feel like we fit into that, or when you say that these like great power dynamics, are you more so referring to those other large superpowers?
So from what I looked at it, when I mentioned great power politics, I was referring to a national security framework on how you look at international relations. And so
Oh,
great power politics, one of the top thinkers out there, a gentleman named John Mearsheimer, who is out of the University of Chicago, and my brother, who was a West Point Army guy, he studied under John Mearsheimer for a time, and I had the pleasure to meet John. I think after my first tour in Iraq. So after my first tour in Iraq, I went back to Chicago and to see the family, and my brother was doing some graduate work down there at University of Chicago, and went and get to sit in the class with Professor Mearsheimer, who's just one of the top thinkers about it. But great power politics is this idea that states, um, countries, they are competing for relative forms of power, and power can be defined in many different ways. But in the sense of a national security construct, it's to be able to protect your interests and do what you want to do. And one of the defining moments when or defining elements when we talk about great power politics is the ability to project power beyond your borders. So if you think of the United States, we can get anywhere in the world and we can project power anywhere in the world. The Russian Federation, although they have ways to project power in many different parts of the world, I mean, they've sent advisors into Syria and they've been elsewhere, and definitely into the Soviet Union, they're around the world. They're much more limited in their power projection these days. And, we're seeing what they're doing in Ukraine, and they're really struggling. But, the Russian Federation would really have a tough time if they wanted to start a war in South America. When we think about the PRC and the People's Republic of China, they are a regional hegemon over there, and they're able to project power beyond their borders and across the water, and they're growing. So it is that interplay, that interaction that we have going on right now between great powers as they are trying to maintain, protect, and project their interests. And,
Um,
when you think of World War One, that was the age of imperialism, and there were great power politics going on there. But, the world had just reached a stage where we could industrialize warfare. And that's why World War One was so bloody, is because the tactics and the strategies had not caught up with the technology. But World War II, the great power competition, it was rumbling in the 30s when we had the rise of the Third Reich in Germany, and there was us, and there was the United Kingdom, and there was the French, and there was Imperial Japan. Everybody was rising, and they were all competing for their interests.
wow, I'm so glad that I went into that with the I am so not qualified to talk about this angle because that was thank you. Yeah, that was I mean I can't hold a candle to any of that. It's it does still though. I mean I mean, do you and I don't want to bog you down in this too much because I do want to be able to get into your story more, but I mean it's still we're kind of seeing that today, like you said, in a new era, and it's just even as you mentioned some of that stuff, and it's probably, I'm not knee deep in this stuff. It sounds like you still probably stay pretty in tune with what's going on with all of these things, given your background in at least in education with politics and history, but with again thinking to the American position, or I guess the American slice of that pie. It does with the border protection. Yeah, we have the ability to do that. We haven't necessarily done that. It seems like we're starting to shore things up. But even like when you think to, and I guess it seems like maybe the government right now is trying to make a shift to mend some of the holes in this infrastructure in terms of bringing manufacturing back. But even like we saw over the past couple of years, we got more and more reliant even on our energy needs from other countries, including from Russia, with shutting down like the oil pipeline and stuff like that. And it's as you look at all of that, again with my layman's eyes looking at that, it does seem like we're kind of lagging behind here. Would you agree with that with your more complete knowledge on the whole situation?
Well, if you look at what Putin is doing with the Russian Federation, he is very much trying to bring back um, the respect and power and influence that the Soviet Union had. He greatly admires Peter the Great, who is considered one of the dynamic, innovative leaders of Russia. And so Putin is trying to bring that back, and he's doing that through expansion. If you look at the PRC, one of their top publicized, you know, foreign policy goals is to protect the survival of the communist regime. And they believe the best way that they can do that is to prevent interference by any outside actor. And you can read between the lines and recognize that that's the United States. And so when you look at us now as the US, one of the primary and maybe the primary reasons why there has not been a global war since 1945 is because of our involvement on the world stage. And That involvement, whether that was a leader in the Cold War or in the post-Cold War era, is because we recognized with our wealth, with our influence, and our vision and view of what freedom is, which is imperfect. You know, there is nothing about our nation or what we do that's perfect. But when you think of good intentions and principles, always trying to be a living and moving thing to strive towards something better, our involvement in international relations has helped prevent a major conflict that, the next one, could potentially wreak catastrophic failure. And we've been able to do that through our partners and allies. I mean, when we invaded Iraq in 2003, as 2-5, our first objective was the oil fields and the GOF, the gas oil separation plants. And as 2-5, we were the long shot. We were going way far north, and we had units on our left and right as we were securing oil fields going on. And after we secured that objective, it was British Royal Marines who were the ones that came to relieve us. And then after we did our march to Baghdad and we went through Nasiriyah and all the way up there, and then we went into Baghdad and went north of Baghdad and came back out and started doing stabilization operations in Samoa, it was the Dutch who came in and relieved us. In Afghanistan, yes, we had American bases all over the place, but we also had Germans. We had French. We had all these different countries over there because we approached world politics and relations in a way of friends and allies. We need our partners.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely critical now going forward. We absolutely need our friends and partners and to approach the challenges we're going to face in the national security arena with our friends and allies. It's like being on a schoolyard. It's like being on a schoolyard in fifth grade and there's a bully, and that's a big bully, and, he's got calluses on his knuckles, and he's a big guy, and, it might he wants to take your lunch, he wants to take your money, or he just wants to push you down. But if you got a bunch of friends that are gonna stand back to back with you, that bully is gonna, 1, either not do it, or 2, he's gonna wish he didn't when you all go against him, and that has been one of our most powerful and influential and components of our security and influence in the world.
Yeah, and I was aware that, all our allied countries were in the Middle East with us. I didn't realize I think and so just to give you a little context, so I went into the Marines in 2014, and like I said, I was in 3-5 all 4 years that I was in, but I was 3 generations removed from combat. Like, my seniors hadn't been to combat, my seniors hadn't been to combat, and some of their seniors had been to combat. And
Mm.
then, obviously platoon sergeant and higher level leadership were combat vets and stuff like that. But, we got so the information I was given on what it's like to go to war was all old and had, there's stuff lost in translation being passed along from senior to junior and things like that. But I'd always had this notion that, okay, the Marines, yeah, we go in, we fuck things up, and then the Army comes behind and is the consolidating and occupying force there and carries on more sustained operations. I didn't realize it was so, and of course I know we were training the Iraqis and Afghanis while we were over there, but like I had no idea that it was so, things were more directly intertwined like that. When you got over there the first time, and I can't remember the movie Jarhead, is it during that period or is that from Desert Storm? Because you were
J
talking about the oil fields.
Yeah, Jarhead's Desert Storm. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it does it, yeah.
Was it, I mean, were they burning oil fields and stuff on the way as you guys were tearing across the country or no?
So they had set fire to a couple, but that was the whole reason we, um, were looking to secure the oil fields within the first 12 hours, was to prevent what had happened during Desert Storm in 1991,
It was that
where
fast.
yeah, where the Iraqi forces essentially lit fire to all the oil fields in Kuwait and on the edge of Iraq, and it would be the middle of the day, but black as night. Uh, when we did it in 2003, we secured most of them, but as we were going up, yeah, you could see some that had been, set on fire and they were burning, but um, it was not as big as they had done back in 1991. That said, there was so much toxic stuff going on when we invaded in 2003. I mean, yeah, I'm sure you as a veteran, and I know I get it from the VA a lot about all the stuff we ingested and breathed, during that time was pretty rough. But, going back to the international component, after I left the Marine Corps, because I left the Marine Corps in 2005, and then I found my way at the CIA and was what's called a paramilitary officer, and I was doing covert action around the world in special operations. And that experience really then opened me up too to recognizing of how international and how important friends and partners are for the stuff we want to do around the world, for the influence we want to have in our own security, our own benefits, our own policies. We need friends in the world, and we have to have good relationships with them because they're going to be the ones beside you when the bullets start flying again. That happened to me more than once where, we were in tight situations and it would be, I have a foreign partner on my left or on my right. And we were trying to do, the executive orders that we were sent to do.
Even so, even when you guys were getting briefs, like, well, like when you guys were in Ramadi, you guys are briefing beforehand. Were foreign forces present at those briefs, and were they actually tied into the plans? I'm sure on, on a higher strategic scale for officers and things there like that, but at your level, because you're an enlisted dude, I mean, you'd been in for like 6 years. What were you, E5-ish around
Yeah.
that time?
So in Ramadi, I was a staff sergeant. So I'd been, what
Okay.
year was that? 2004. So I'd been in about 9 years about that point.
Okay.
Yeah. And I got promoted to gunny, I think, later that year while I was there in Ramadi. Um, but yeah, it would depend on the operation. So in Ramadi, we were at Hurricane Point. We had Golf Company out there at Combat Outpost. We had um, over there in Snake Pit, Fox Company, and then Echo was with us at Hurricane Point, and then Blue Diamond, which was across the river. That's where the First Marine Division headquarters was, and then Junction City, Hurricane Point, or not Hurricane Point, but Junction City. That's where the Army was, and they had I think, a division there, or a brigade. I'm sorry, not a division, but a brigade. And so, depending on the operation, we might have Army soldiers in those briefing with us. If there was a foreign entity or a foreign element maneuvering through, they would be in the meetings with us. If it was a joint operation with our, Iraqi commando units or things like that, they would be in the briefing with us. You would have to moderate what the type of briefing was depending on the intelligence that was going on. But yeah, we would have them from an operational standpoint. We would be doing it side by side and who's doing what. And that was all the way, that was 3, 4 years into it, we were working with those foreign partners.
Wow. It's okay. It's wild to think, even having been in, not being aware of that. And, I got sent to a bunch of advanced schools and stuff like that and learned, advanced machine guns. You learn how to do write your 5 paragraph orders and all these things. And you wind up with this 50-page stack of paper, of handwritten papers with your
Yeah,
orders and
yeah.
your briefs and your
Oh, yeah.
everything that you've made. It's just horrible. But like, not realizing or not having been, because even, my instructors at these courses were typically combat vets. There were a couple that weren't at the different advanced schools that I went to, but most of them were, and not getting tied in. And I guess, I think when I went to advanced machine guns, I was a corporal. So it's not like, I guess a corporal doesn't really have a need to know that, but it's just, I'm kind of blown away right now by the fact that I wasn't aware of any of that stuff, and just the larger scale, really, to any meaningful extent. But I'm curious, and I'm not dragging you into talking about combat here. I'm very careful about that. I don't feel warranted in doing that with people, and that's also not really what we're here to talk about. But I am to give listeners some context. Ramadi was incredibly horrendous urban fighting in the war, and during another battle you were also awarded the Silver Star. Like, you've been in the thick of it a lot. When you got out, but prior to going and doing the paramilitary stuff with the CIA, You went to college in between, correct?
I did. Yeah. Yeah.
That shift for you, how, I mean, how are you able to turn that off? And I guess with that, were you married? Did you have kids at that point as you were transitioning out after 10 years? And I've had, I think I've recorded 33 or 34 episodes of this thing so far. And each of the veterans that I've had on that are combat vets have talked about that struggle transitioning. And even non-combat vets have an issue with that. So I can't imagine having to turn that off after having experienced what you experienced. Did you struggle with that?
I'll say that I am still struggling with it. That's one of the reasons I write.
Um,
And we might get into that later. I'm still trying to figure it out. And I can't I can't claim credit for this, but I heard another writer talk and they said the reason I write is because I'm trying to figure out all the shit I've seen in my life. And so for me, I think that's definitely part of it. I'm trying to make sense of things. And I don't expect to ever make sense of all of it because I don't think there's a way to. But when I left the Marine Corps in November of 2005, left Camp Pendleton, drove to Las Vegas where we were having our Marine Corps ball. So that was my last Marine Corps ball in the MGM Grand. And the
okay.
2.5 and all the attachments where they were getting ready to go back to Iraq. So that was my last Marine Corps ball. And then I continued along, or they weren't going back to Iraq. They were doing a MU. I think they were going to Okinawa, maybe. I think they were going out there in the, doing one of the Pacific ones. Anyway,
Okay.
I continued across the country. Excuse me. Continued across the country. I had a job lined up at Quantico. What I was gonna, as a contractor, a civilian contractor, was gonna work at Marine Corps Combat Development Command and was helping write some of the new coin doctrine that we were using. And then I started
So
going to
the
Georgetown.
counterinsurgency is what you're referring to with coin.
Yeah, yeah, counterinsurgency.
Okay.
Um, and I started going to Georgetown. And you're right. It was a big transition because it was 2005, 2006. It was hot and heavy in Iraq still. Afghanistan was still going on, and I very much felt like not just a fish out of water. I felt like I was a fish in the frying pan. And the reason is because I was relatively young. I was in my late 20s, and I am now going to school with people much younger than me, some of whom were probably in elementary school when 9/11 happened. Uh, and well, maybe not that young, but anyway, they were significantly younger than me. And trying to interact with them was a challenge, particularly I was taking, I was in the School of Foreign Service, so I was taking national security classes, and we were talking about grand strategy and things like that. And I definitely had opinions, but I definitely had an opinion from the foxhole. But I'm trying to learn these theories and interact with these other very talented, smart students. I made some really good friends, but then I was also struggling with all my internal demons, as well as in a contractor and then, Beltway world where people had witnessed the war through PowerPoint in the Pentagon. And,
Mm,
I very much on occasion, found myself in a situation where I would have a lot of um, comments were made or opinions were expressed, and it was very personal to me
yeah.
because I had either lost friends or had stuff happen to me or done stuff that they were talking about in a very either abstract or impersonal or flippant way. And there was association stuff going on about, people trying to, discuss what they did and what they didn't do. And it was tough. I'm not gonna lie. I still look back on those 3 years at school and there were some situations, that I could have handled differently. I remember popping off in class one time because Darfur was kind of like a topic back then, the genocide that was going on in Darfur. And I
Yeah.
remember a student said something about, Darfur and we were reading, oh, shoot, I can't even think of, Lord of the Flies, and, there was different things about, human nature,
Yeah.
and I remember this one student said, "Well, I can't believe why people just don't stop that stuff." And, I remember turning around and I said, "You don't know what the fuck you would do in a situation like that." And I realized as soon as I said, I'm like, "Oh, I can't do that."
Yeah.
No matter what I have boiling inside me, you can't just pop off like that.
Well, in the Marines, that would have been fine.
Yeah,
Like that's you've also got that going on.
yeah,
Like that's direct level of like, really, you want to fucking run your mouth right now? That is
yeah,
absolutely how that culture works. But
yeah.
was
But
there? Oh, go ahead.
well, I was just gonna say, and then, I found myself in the pipeline to get into, being a paramilitary officer, and that's when you kinda shut everything back down and you go back into that world, and, you don't really reconcile yourself with it until you come out the other side.
I have one more question that I thought about while you were talking about this with the other students. Was there obviously there's always one, like, and there's always one asshole, but like generally, was there animosity towards you as having, you're in there with idyllic kids and you've just come back from a war? Was there hatred towards guys who had served, or was that not really a factor there?
My experience, no.
Okay.
The professors embraced me, the dean, um, I developed a very good relationship with. In fact, the dean that was in the seat when I graduated is still a friend of mine. We're about the same age.
Oh,
So we would go out and grab a beer. And then I became very good friends with another professor of mine and a handful that I still keep in touch with. They, unlike, I think, the Vietnam experience, I had a very welcoming. I think with a lot of the students, some of them didn't know what to think. Who's this old guy in class? And, oh,
mm.
he's a Marine, and, oh, he's been at war. It was like, who is this, weird museum thing? Uh,
You're
but
like a relic.
yeah, but then other students would be very interested, and very, very sharp, very talented. But it was I did not have a negative experience in that regard, which I feel very fortunate for.
Well, that's funny that I mean, you mentioned Vietnam. That's where my train of thought went. I was like, I haven't heard about that happening, but I just, that was still in the heart of the war too. But honestly, dude, I didn't know. This also sounds so naive saying this. I didn't know that the like paramilitary side of the CIA existed until, I don't know, a year and a half ago. I've been so I didn't notice or realize until I was an adult that I liked reading, and then I became a huge science fiction and fantasy nerd. And then I heard who did I heard is it I don't know if it's Mark Greaney or Mark Graney on Jeff Rogan's podcast, and then um oh my gosh, I can't remember. There's another author who I had listened to, and I started. But I point is, I started reading these like these thrillers that I feel like are like an old man phase of my life, where I'm like, okay, this is. I'm almost 30. This makes sense that I'm starting to read these like paramilitary thriller novels, but
Yeah.
and I think they started talking about the ground branch, which and I'm curious if that's even a real thing. But I started. That's when I, made me aware of the fact that the CIA has its own forces kind of operating around the world, and that's for you. Was it because you mentioned that that kind of locked you back into a certain mode? Is it was that shift pretty much? I mean, you're college educated at this point. Was it all pretty much college educated combat veterans that you're working alongside?
So, one, Mark Greaney's a great guy, and he writes, wonderful stuff with his Gray Man series. So I'm glad you're reading Mark. There's a bunch of other guys out there that write really talented stuff. If you enjoy that, Andrews and Wilson, I would recommend them. They've taken over the Tom Clancy series.
Okay, I've
They're
been
writing
reading
some.
Jack Carr too.
Oh yeah, Jack Carr,
Yeah.
he's a former SEAL. Brad Thor, he writes great stuff as well. He's another good friend. There's some folks out there writing some really good stuff. and it's entertaining. And I'll
Yeah.
admit, one of the reasons I found myself in the career I found myself in was because I was reading Robert Ludlum and Jason Bourne and Tom Clancy when I was a kid. So
Mhm.
I was reading that stuff that I never, I know it's fiction, but you get inspired because you know there's probably granules of truth in there somewhere.
Yeah.
So everything I'm about to say, I've said before, and it's either on the CIA website or I've been approved to say it by the Publication Review Board. Because everything I write now, I have to get approved, or everything I write or speak about, I have to get approved through the CIA Review Board to ensure there's no classified or sensitive information in there. And so, yes, within CIA, there's something called a paramilitary officer, which I was, and I was indeed part of Ground Branch, and I was with that unit for many many years. And the CIA has, multiple missions. The primary ones are to collect intelligence, to go out there to gather it. You think of it like, meeting a spy in a back alley somewhere or doing something like technical to steal some secrets. The other mission is to analyze that intelligence, to then feed that information to our government's decision makers so that they can decide what the policy will be. CIA does not determine policy. That is the responsibility of the executive and the president. And then third one, which is kind of intertwined, is counterintelligence in there. And then we have what's called covert action. So covert action is very specifically defined in Title 50 of the U.S. Code, and I can't quote it specifically, but think of it basically as you are going to conduct an activity that is going to influence a foreign environment either through military, economic, diplomatic, or some type of other social means to cause some type of action, but you are going to hide the hand of the US government or make it look like somebody else did it. That's what covert action is. Covert gets thrown around all over the place, that term, whether you're watching the movies or in the book or something like that. That's what covert action is. CIA is where covert action resides within the US government. What I mean by that is, in 1947, when CIA, came about in the National Security Act, Title 50 is where that resides, and it's within CIA. So any other element of the US government that is involved in covert action has to be somehow tucked underneath CIA authorities. I'm not going to go into the details of how that all shakes out in the end.
Yeah.
But when you think of a covert action, there's the president has what's called a finding, an executive finding, where he says, "I find that this is a threat to the United States government, and we're going to do X," and then it gets approved and funded, and we're off to the races doing what we're going to do. But yes, the paramilitary world, the special activities world, is the special operations side of the Joint Special Operations community, and it's in that intelligence covert action realm.
Yeah, and that's as you were talking, I wanted to ask if that was tied into JSOC at all, but also I'm sure someone who hears this or just heard that is going to be thinking like, "What the fuck? Like the CIA is doing that? That's bullshit." Before you take that reaction, realize that every government around the world is doing that same thing. They were not the only ones doing it. So, but had you sought that out, or how did you even end up there?
No, I didn't seek it out. So it happened by chance, and I didn't figure out until a couple years after I was already at CIA how my name got, brought up and all that. So the short of it is no. When I left the Marine Corps in 2005, I was leaning towards either going up to New York and becoming a corporate banker or joining the State Department to be a Foreign Service officer. I know those two sound very different, but to me
Very,
to
yeah.
me they made sense.
Okay.
Um, I got a phone call from an unknown number, and that phone call turned into a 30-minute interview where nobody really told me what was going on. They were just interviewing me. And then over the course of a period of time later, in-person interviews and various types of tests. And eventually I found out what I was being assessed for, which was to be a paramilitary officer. And, that's when I joined the CIA and was undercover for many years doing that. But I tell this stories because, again, I had no idea how they knew who I was. Well, it turns out the individual who called me receive my resume from somebody else I had given my resume to when I was still a contractor because I was looking for work. I was paying my own way through school, so I had to pay for my apartment, my food, all that type of stuff. So another contractor had my resume who was in the pipeline to go to CIA to be an analyst. He gets my resume, passes it off to somebody he knew over in the paramilitary world. Well, it turns out this guy had served in Iraq in a location that I had also been in, and he knew of me from that time. And so it took me about 2 years of being at the agency to figure out that chain of how my resume got to who and got the phone call. And then I ended up getting to serve with that individual a number of years later. We were serving in East Africa together, and out there afraid and or alone and unafraid. Just me and him running around East
Yeah.
Africa doing some wild stuff.
That is so insane, but also, like, I guess you would kind of hope that an entry story into the CIA paramilitary side of things is that obscure and, like, behind like, smoky and kind of mysterious. But as you were doing all of this, did you have a family yet? I mean, this Marine Corps aside, especially the time that you were in, like, Jesus Christ, but then this would be the same kind of things, except now I can't talk about it, and I'm all over the world.
So I did not when I went into the Marine Corps, I was still single. I got married a couple years later, and I did not have children till many, many years later. And I started slowing down, my eyes started going and a few other things. And I had shifted over into, as you work your way up in a bureaucracy, which, the agency certainly is, you find yourself in different roles. So I was in a position where I was not on the road doing the gun show, and I was doing some other very interesting, fascinating stuff. Particularly when we talk about like global operations and things along those lines. But that's when I had my son, and then years later had my daughter. I was fortunate in that, I did not have that challenge when I was very operational. I know a lot of guys who did, and I know a lot of guys who had to contend with, the challenges of being gone for 3 months and your spouse having no clue where you are, or even if you're coming home, and your children going through the same bit, as really young children. And where I think the military is able to celebrate and honor the service members as they should be, and they're able to embrace the families and the children can learn the legacies of what their parent did or went through. The agency is much different. That stuff is kept hidden and it's a secret. And yes, if something bad happens, we're able to talk to the families and wrap them into our family. But the reality is the majority of what you're doing is very close hold and very, very, very secret for good reasons. And it's a struggle. And I remember many times, coming off an airplane where I'd been overseas doing something and probably been on target, 24 hours before then. And I'd get off the airplane and had found some place to shave. And, we were going to go get pizza, or maybe we were going to look at wedding invitations, or maybe, I was going to find myself at, some type of school event. Yeah, it's, you definitely lived a different life.
That seems even more like the juxtaposition between being at work and off work being even sharper than what it's like in the military. At least when you, like we've both already touched on, yes, military, unless, if you're a special operations dude in the military, you're probably going places where your family doesn't know where you're at. But if you're a general infantryman, your family knows at least generally where you're at. Everyone knows, okay, they're going to be gone for 6 months, 9 months, 15 months, and there's support there for the family. But like, and even on the way coming back, it's another unit is coming in to take your spot. And so you're doing gear turnover, and there's, a month long period there where there's kind of a phase back and knowing and mentally preparing and getting ready to go back. Whereas you are 24 hours later back in probably one of the safest countries in the world and safest environments that you could be in. Obviously, things aren't perfect out there, and bad things can still happen, but that and I guess that kind of brings me back to I wanted to ask you about this earlier because we kind of touched on it. You mentioned like, hey, I am still struggling with this stuff and are still processing it and working through it. And it sounds even like when you said that, it almost sounded like there was still a considerable weight to it. Like it sounded that was no light thing for you to say. And I'm curious. So there's going to be other people listening here, and I also want to be able to talk about your writing. And I know that you mentioned that helped you, but what has in specifically both in the context of what you did in the Marines, and then even with that, have the just this flipping the switch like that on and off and on and off. What has in particular, if there is anything outside of your writing before we start getting into that, what have you done over the years that has helped kind of at least keep the demons at bay with some of these things and help you start to work through some of these things?
I think there's two, we could talk about this for a long time. I think there's two things that I'll share. Is one is I'm not somebody that wants to or feels compelled to talk about the demons. So I know a lot of veterans, they get a lot of value and benefit from like a support group. And that's great because we all process trauma and stress and whatever it is we're dealing with. We all process it in different ways. We're not just machines, as everybody knows. We're human beings and we interact based on our physiological makeup as well as our experiences in life. I was never one to really see a bet or never get a benefit from a support group. And the reason I say that is because I don't want to talk about it. What I found was that when I talked about it, for me at least, it resurrected the demons in a way that made it worse for me. That wasn't, I'm not trying to say that I'd suppressed it, but to be forced to talk about it um, wasn't helpful for me. And when I talked to a counselor at one point, she looked at me and said, "You're just one of those people that talking about it can actually exacerbate the issue. So don't talk about it." And I took that as like, okay, I don't have to conform to this. Oh, I need to go to the VA and have a support group and this, that, and the other. I'm like, okay, I'm dealing with this how at this point in my life, I need to deal with it.
Yeah.
She also said, very, very smart counselor. She also said, Adam, you have done and witnessed some horrific things, some of the worst of humanity, and have been involved in things that most people can't even fathom. If you didn't have nightmares, if you didn't have cold sweats, if you didn't feel uneasy when some of these things are triggered, that's when something would be wrong with you. And that
Oh,
that really resonated with me because it's like, one thing that I will say since 9/11 is there's been this acceptance and acknowledgement of, post-traumatic stress, whether you wanna call it shell shock, from World War II or, all the other terms that have been used over the years. When you are shot or if you are, injured in an explosion or something, you have a visible scar and people can see it. But there's other types of trauma and things are happening that are not physically visible. And those scars exist. And if we did not change or adapt or behave differently from those scars, that's when something's wrong. And so it's okay, to know that you have the nightmares. It's okay to know that you get anxious or to have these sweats or whatever it might be, or that something triggers you and you have an outburst, or maybe you get quiet, or maybe you don't want to leave your house, or you don't want to talk to any friends because you just can't engage right now. it's important to recognize, I think, what those are, and I've tried my best to recognize those challenges that I face and say, "These are okay. Now how do I work through my day? And how do I keep going?" Because we all gotta keep going. It's just how do we choose that, you know?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, on multiple levels, what you just said was beautiful and perfect, and obviously, I cannot imagine, and I can't relate to that, but I think you said a lot of valuable things in there, and first with the counselor mentioning, like, maybe you're one of those people who doesn't have to talk about it. That's the first time that I've heard that, but and I, because even when you first started talking about that and you said, like, support groups weren't your thing, my immediately I wanted to ask, okay, well, what about one-on-one counseling like that? Because that's a very different context, even though you're still talking about the same things, but that's what I heard through all of that and following you through that is, and you actually specifically said that doesn't mean that you're suppressing it. Like, you are still aware of it and you are still doing what you need to do to process it. And I think, I'm sure you probably have all sorts of diagnoses, including PTSD. And but I hear people a lot. And again, I don't want this to, I'm not, I mean, in the larger context of the world, not just people or, combat veterans. I'm definitely not saying this against combat veterans because I can't relate, but you hear people hiding behind a diagnosis a lot. I have ADHD. I have depression. I have this or that, and yeah, I think you could do that with PTSD as well, or really anything like that. I'm sure when you have bigger issues like that aren't treatable, that might be a different scenario, but, like, it sounds like you're okay, you're aware of these things, like you said, your triggers, but you're being aware of them and making sure that you are aware of them allows you to continue to operate and not hide behind, nor, like, make the fact that you deal with that stuff your identity to the extent that it's crippling. Would that be
Yeah, I
correct?
try yeah, I try not to, but what I wanna maybe say as well is, like, for me, like, the support group just it didn't work for me, but for other people, it does, but I'm a huge fan of that trusted confidant. So I've got a couple people that I've either served with or know in my life where we can go to the bar and I can have too much to drink and I could just let it all flow out.
Yeah.
And you know what? That to me is a way that maybe I am talking about it because I don't know how to do something else yet. Maybe it's just flowing out. And I've been very fortunate that I do have a couple of those individuals in my life. And I've tried to find other outlets, like Memorial Day is coming up. Veterans Day is another day that's hard for me. I'm a runner. And so on Memorial Day and Veterans Day, I do a 15-mile run. And I remember like the names of everybody I've served with who's no longer with us or that we've lost. Those are the names that are ticking through my head. And I'm running because I do good thinking when I'm running. It's a
Yeah.
physical activity, but it's helping me have those emotional moments as I'm thinking about, the brothers that I've lost or the things that have happened. It is emotional and it's tough for me. And there have been some times in my life too where it's been very dark and, where, I have struggled with day to day and what I'm going to be doing and how I'm going to be doing it. It's not easy. And I try to hide that from folks. I'm getting better talking about it now. Like I will fully admit that I struggle with these things
Mhm.
because I'm recognizing that if I'm struggling with this, I know other people out there are too. It doesn't mean that they went through the same stuff as me or at all. We all process things differently, and it's important to accept that within each other and back each other up and support each other. And I think that's critical for service members is recognizing, we've all have a shared experience in some way, shape, or form, and that we are a support and a backer and an advocate for each other.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times, and it almost sounded to me like that's, when you do have a couple tasty beverages and let some of it out, like just having someone who will just listen and
Yeah.
not lend their 2 cents, just let you get it out. And then, if you ask for some form of input from them, then you can have that and they'll give that to you in a gentle way that still holds you accountable or whatever you need. But I think that's an under recognized asset that we have. And I think was, I, I've been the listener a lot for people who have been to combat where it comes up and it's like you can tell, okay, I don't know how we got here, but I'm listening now and I'm glad that I can be there for them. And like sometimes it seems like that's all, at least when I've been on the receiving end of that stuff, it seems like that's just what people need sometimes. It's just that safe person to talk to where, okay, yeah, I can let it loose. The conversation's not gonna leave this instance and we're gonna move on afterwards. And I just I think especially with, I mean, the suicide epidemic of veterans was 22 a day while I was in. That was the number that was always thrown around. And then I heard that during COVID it got as high as 40. I don't know. That's hard to know because a lot of times those numbers come from the VA and you're like, all right, how much of that is accurate reporting and things like that. But I think, you know, there will be a person who hears what another combat veteran or just someone who's been through highly intense situations like that and has come out the other side with some of those invisible scars that you talked about and maybe have an idea of another way that they can try and deal with the stressors that are kind of lingering with them. But with you, because I've dragged you too far into the weeds here because I know you wanted to try and keep this around an hour or so because you got stuff to do. You mentioned, and I know you started writing, I think you said while you were in the CIA, but you've mentioned that writing for you has been a huge coping mechanism. Is it, I mean, are you, is it because you're writing basically, yes, it's a different protagonist, but you're putting your own experiences to some extent, or at least threads of your own experiences into these stories?
I do. I mean, there's that adage out there, write what you know. Um, but I think every author out there who's writing fiction, they are they're exposing something of themselves through their writing, whether it's science fiction, fantasy, because I'm a big sci-fi, fantasy reader as well. You know, right now I'm reading Way of the Kings. I enjoy that stuff.
Yeah.
And I read historical fiction. I'm a very diverse reader. Historical fiction, love Hemingway, love Steinbeck. I read the thrillers. I like the cozy mysteries. Not so much into romance, but a good romance within a thriller is a good thing. So
Yeah.
but I think all writers are sharing something of themselves when they're writing because you're interpreting human interaction, and then you're trying to put it on the page that somebody else is going to find entertaining or is going to grab them or they're going to find it interesting. So for me, with some of the spy fiction I've written, some of it has been a look at, hey, I had these experiences or this incident or this person, and it was really fascinating or it was really cool or wow, that was really rough. And then trying to write it and trying to write around it to maybe pull out some of the emotion or some of the themes and feelings that were going on and to tell it in a compelling way. I didn't start writing though, thinking that it was going to be therapeutic to be honest. I started writing because I thought about it and maybe this was my unconscious way of thinking about it, but I thought to myself, I'm like, because I was a number of years into, I'd already had my 10 years in the Marine Corps and all that, fun and hoopla that went with that. And now I'm over in here at CIA doing all these things. And I remember I was on an operation. We were in a safe house, and we'd been in there for like a month and a half, and it was not in a very nice part of the world. And I just, you got a lot of time to think. It was just me and one other individual. That's where I started writing my first scene, that never got published. It turned into a book, but it never got published. Turned into a manuscript, but never got published. But I started writing that, and I started thinking. I've always been a reader. I've always been a writer, but I'd never really focused on creative writing. And so I started thinking about where I was in my life and the things that were going on. I said, what really what when I wake up in the morning, what kind of makes me happy? And I was trying to think about my early childhood and life, a lot of self-reflection. And I realized that for me it was history, and for me it was reading. And so when I started thinking about historical fiction and thrillers and mysteries and Jean Le Carré and Ludlum and Green and all these other folks, and then the writers of today. You got Mark Greaney out there, who's doing some great stuff. You've got Brad Thor, who's doing some amazing stuff. You got Jack Stewart, who's up and coming. He's a Top Gun pilot writing about fighter pilots. He's got a 3-book series out there, and I met all these
Cool.
friends. Yeah, I met all these friends in the writing community. They're doing just really fascinating stuff. So for me, and this is before I ever met them. Uh, I started realizing that, wow, if I could do this full time, if I could do this often, boy, that would really be a great day. And then I started thinking to myself, I'm like, if I have a good day in the agency, it probably meant I've ruined somebody else's life, either for whatever reason. I've probably done something that's, in the interest of national security, but is probably, given someone a bad day around the world.
That's a heavy
Yeah.
reality to think about.
And so I started thinking, I'm like, well, what makes me happy? And it was reading and writing. And so that's when I started getting into it. And in the beginning, it was just, hey, I'm going to try to tell a good story. But then as the years went on, a couple years ago, like I said, I was listening to a podcast about writing, and this author was saying, I'm trying to make sense of all the shit that's happened in my life. And I thought to myself, I'm like, wow, I never knew that. But in some way, that's what I'm trying to do. Whether I'm writing a contemporary spy thriller that ends up in Europe, or right now I'm working on a project that's set in the month before World War One. It's a historical fiction. I'm trying to make sense of, one, my understanding of the world around me, and two, the experiences I've had in life. And if I can convey them on paper, to me, it's in a way, it's been therapeutic. I do dial it back. There are some things I'm not ready to share yet or explore, and my agent talks to me. She says, "Whenever you're ready to finally write about that stuff, you're going to have a bestseller." And I said, "Well, I don't know if I'll ever get there, but
Yeah.
it's that idea of like putting these things out there and then exposing yourself in a way. It's like, okay, I'm okay with that."
And I think also the other side of that is having someone who's actually lived that, writing about it, I mean, it makes it more interesting. That's part of the reason. Yes, I started with the Mark Greaney with the Gray Man novels, but like once I found out about Jack Carr, I'm like, all right, this dude's a SEAL. He knows what he's talking about. And like nothing drives me more nuts in like a book or a movie, and you hear someone talking about like firearms or like basic tactical shit, and it's like, okay, they didn't research this at all, or they've obviously never held a firearm or whatever. And it makes it so much more authentic too as a reader to be able to dig into that. And also, like when I read that, like I said, I'm still like, in the early days of my thriller phase here, but like with reading Jab Carr's novels, it leaves like another lens to it where I do, as I'm reading it, like curious, like, okay, how much of that is tied to like what did that seems like that was tied to an experience, or just I don't, it makes for an interesting, I guess it's probably because I'm interested in people's stories. So I get interested in the author's stories, like personal stories, and start to wonder about those things. But I think, what you said there is also very similar to when I did speak with Jeff Circle and I had an Air Force OSI agent on who moved into counterterrorism. When the war kicked off, Dave Jones, he's an author as well. And it's very similar, I guess, sharings of the healing aspects here where like, yes, kind of even like sometimes tiptoeing around something or even just loosely basing something off of an experience has proven to be very, very therapeutic. And I know It sounded so you've got two novels out as well as a book that you co-authored, correct?
Yes, so the co-authored book was with Nilüfer Rahmani, who was Afghanistan's first female Air Force pilot. And when I encountered her, we have the same agent, and it's basically my agent called me up and said, "Adam, you've been to Afghanistan. You're the one to write this." I said,
Well,
"Okay." I said, "Okay." So was already living here in the States. She was thinking seeking political asylum, and it's her story. It's about her growing up under the Taliban, growing up as a refugee in Pakistan, her father who fought in the Soviet-Afghan War in the '80s, and
Jesus.
then 9/11 happened, and when the Afghan Air Force announced they were gonna start recruiting women to be pilots, she was one of the first recruits and became the first fixed-wing Air Force pilot. There were 2 female Afghan Air Force pilots in the '80s, but they were helicopter pilots. So Nilüfer was the first fixed wing, and it's essentially her story, of everything she went through all the way to the end where she could not go back to Kabul because her own unit, her fellow pilots would have killed her or given her up for the Taliban. Um, she was undergoing, C-130 flight training here in the States when that happened, and she sought political asylum. And that book came out, a few weeks before we pulled out of Afghanistan in 2021, so
Oh my gosh.
that was a pretty wild time. Um, the other 2 books, the first one is Landslide, which was my debut, and, it's, surprise, surprise, there's a former Marine or Marine in there, who's
Shocker.
yeah, shocker, and then it's a spy novel with a CIA operation that goes bad,
Okay.
and, he finds himself rocketing across Europe, and he ends up, in Ukraine, and I wrote it before the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine in 2022. My last few years at the agency, I got a very intimate experience doing counter-Russia work, working in Russia House and a few other things. So again, I took a fictional story and kind of laced some, experiences with it. And that's what became Landside. That's more of a gritty spy thriller. And then The Underhanded, I wrote, it's more along the lines of a Dan Brown, Steve Barry conspiracy that's going on. I tied it all the way back to the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, and but it's set in modern times, and there's artificial intelligence and machine learning and social manipulation and all these different types of things pushing population and political views to extremist means. With this villain that's doing this, and you've got a history professor in there, and you've got a MI6 officer who's involved, and or British intelligence, and that's what that story is. That came out last year.
Man,
Uh,
we got some deep cuts going on in that one, dude.
it was fun. It was fun to write that because even though, like, I mentioned and we've been talking about how writing is therapeutic, I mean, fundamentally, novels are about entertainment. They may be
Yeah.
informative, they may, touch on something that really did happen in life, but ultimately, when we're picking up a novel, we want to be entertained and drawn in and get to know the characters. And so that's what I've tried to do with some of this writing is to tell an engaging story that somebody's wanna gonna keep reading.
Yeah, and I mean, especially with a thriller, man, I mean, that's a different level of it where, I mean, the pacing there has to be, just obnoxious to try and keep up while you're writing, and, again, I know you need to get out of here, so I 2 more things. How how close did you come to hitting the nail on the head with landslide ending in Ukraine with what eventually came to pass?
So, yeah, so I wrote it before they invaded, and, Russia or the Russian Federation invaded in February of '22, and my book was already what's called in the typesetting stage of publication, which is where you can't really change anything.
Mm.
You can't, all the commas that are gonna be in your novel, they're there, and if they're not there, they're not gonna be. You can't change anything, and it was set for publication in September, like 6 months later, and so when the Russian Federation invaded, I called my publisher. I'm saying, "Is there any way you can get this book out, like, tomorrow or speed up publication date?" And they said, "No, there's just the pipeline and how things work with supply chain. There wasn't a way to do it." But what
Uh,
I'll say is if you read landslide, it tracks very closely with what actually happened. And so what I mean by that is, I don't want to give any spoilers out there for anybody who might read it, but it's before the war, but there ends up in a border tense situation that looks very close to what was happening in February of 2022. Which was kind of a learning education factor for me. I thought when I started writing Landslide, it was I think 2018 when I was writing it, starting to write it. I tried to pick an element of the world and a situation that was plausible, but was not headline news. I'm like, well, everybody's kind of forgot about Crimea from, 2014. Everybody kind of
Yes.
forgot about that type of stuff. We're just kind of in this lull right now. And everybody, the Russians are a great villain for novels. They have been for years, since the end of World War II, the Soviets and the Russians. So I'm like, I'm going to pick the Russian Federation and I'm going to make them kind of bad. And I'm going to go over here in Ukraine that most people probably can't even find on a map. Um,
That is
it
so
just
crazy.
yeah, it just goes to show that, um, sometimes when you are writing a modern day thriller, be careful where you choose your setting because the world could be totally different by the time it comes out.
Yeah, that had to be surreal, man. I mean, that's and I am interested. Do either of those have audiobooks?
They both do, they both.
Okay.
So all 3 do. You can get them on Amazon, they're in Audible and a couple other ways as well, but yeah, they're yeah, all Audible.
Well, I'm gonna have to check them out, and I will definitely be following up with you at some point, probably to get a refresher for some more thriller recommendations after I read your books. And I just I appreciate you, first of all, letting me go a little over on time here. Second of all, just being willing to be vulnerable and open up, and because like I said, I think what you said here, some of this stuff is definitely going to help other people. And also just thank you for your service, man. I know that I mean that I, as you can probably imagine, and I don't know if you remember what it was like as an 18-year-old joining the infantry, and like all you want is to join the ranks of your combat instructors and become a combat veteran. And like that is a, hallowed ground in the military. I appreciate everything that you've done for this country and that you're still out there. I'm glad you've been able to navigate this stuff, and I know you're still working through it. If you ever get in a dark place, man, just keep pushing through. I think you of all people, it sounds like, have recognized that it is worth coming out on the other side of it. And just thank you for everything.
Zach, it was a pleasure talking with you, and thank you for everything you've done and you're doing as well. From one Marine to another, Semper Fi, brother, and keep doing the good work. It's a pleasure and honor to know you. Thanks for having me
Semper,
on.
yeah, Semper Fi. And thanks everyone at home for listening to another episode of Going In Blind. Remember, if you haven't already, rate and review the show wherever you listened, and then share this around with someone who needs to hear it.